All right, so hello, thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Rodrigo Werle. I'm an assistant professor and an extension weed scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today, I'm going to be talking about planting soybean green and how that practice can help with integrated weed management. Before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the UW-Madison Weed Science Cover Crop research team and also co-authors in this presentation, Jose Jr. Nunes, who is a PhD student in our program, Dan Smith and Kobe Grant. Both are outreach specialists with the Nutrient and Pest Management program here at UW-Madison. And then Nick Arneson, who is an outreach program manager, and Ryan DeWorf, who is a research specialist here in our weed science program. Today, I'm going to be talking about planting soybean green. And some might be wondering, what is planting soybean green? What is planting green, Rodrigo? And planting green is the practice of establishing a cash crop into a living cover crop. In the scenario here, what we're doing, we're planting soybeans into standing cereal rye cover crop. Why would one do that? In parts of the country and under certain conditions, that cover crop window is limited. And in order to achieve effective levels of weed suppression from cover crops, we need biomass. Research has shown that the more biomass we can produce out of cover crops, more weed suppression can be observed. So in some instances where there's not enough of a window for the cover crop to grow prior to the establishment, it might be beneficial to plant green and then terminate it afterwards, which is being done here in this image. Here's just two contrasting scenarios. On the left, we have a crop that was planted in the absence of a cover crop. And on the right here, we have an image of our soybean crop that was planted green into standing cereal rye. And you can see here this nice residue in between the soybean rows. And the other thing you can notice in these two different pictures here is that here you have a lot more weeds growing on the left versus in the scenario on the right here, where you have pretty much no weeds observed at this point in the growing season. Why is that important? Why would one consider that extra layer of complexity into their crop production systems? From a post-emergence weed control standpoint, management of weeds, especially of pigweeds, is becoming very difficult across the United States. Pigweeds have become some major troublesome weeds for soybean growers. Here's just an example of a waterhemp population from southern Wisconsin that we've been doing some research with. We have exposed this one waterhemp accession to 7 different herbicides from 6 different sites of action. And these are herbicides that are commonly used post-emergence in both corn and soybean cropping systems. And then as you can see here in this image, none of them provided effective control of this waterhemp population. And that's very, very concerning. And that's why we need to start thinking outside of the jug and start bringing more and more integrated weed management strategies into our weed control portfolio, and cover crops can be an effective tool there to help suppress some of these weeds. So in order to elucidate what I'm trying to say here, I'm going to rely on some research that has been published. What I want to convey here is how these cover crops can help us manage pigweed species. Okay, so on the left here, I have some work that was published by Stecco et al. In 2003. And in this research here, what they did, they evaluated waterhemp growth, that's the image on top, and waterhemp seed production, that's the image on the bottom here, in response to different levels of shade. Okay, so from left to right, as we increased shade, as we intercepted more and more light, the less those waterhemp plants were able to grow. And the less they grew, the fewer seeds they were able to produce. Okay, so promoting canopy in our systems, intercepting light as much as possible, will prevent those waterhemp plants from growing and setting several seeds, as can be seen here. On the other side, I want to talk about some research that was published by Jaw et al. In 2010. And in this research, they evaluated how temperature fluctuation and light interfere on pigweed, in this case, Palmer amaranth germination. And what they learned from this research is that as you prevent exposure to light and as you reduce temperature fluctuation, you reduce pigweed, again, Palmer amaranth emergence, germination, and emergence. Okay, so by having that nice mat of a cover crop residue in season, you're going to be intercepting light and you're going to be reducing the temperature fluctuation in the soil surface, therefore reducing the total amount of pigweed seeds that will germinate and establish. And that can be very beneficial. One common question that we get from our soybean growers is, how much cereal rye biomass do we need to effectively suppress pigweeds? Okay, and when I'm talking about pigweeds, I'm talking about both Palmer amaranth, and I'm also talking about Waterhemp. In order to address that question, we conducted this research in 2021, and this research is also going to be replicated in 2022. And what we did, we laid different amounts of cereal rye biomass on soil surface. And at 42 days after establishing that study, we counted the number of emerged Waterhemp plants, and we also evaluated their growth by collecting their biomass. And our treatments there range from no cereal rye biomass all the way to 10,000 pounds. The results here are quite interesting. So on the left side here is Waterhemp emergence, or the total number of plants that established under those treatments. And what we learned here is that in order to reduce Waterhemp emergence or establishment by 50%, we needed approximately 7,000 pounds of dry cereal rye biomass. Okay. However, when we look at Waterhemp growth, about 1,000 pounds of cereal rye, 1,000 pounds of cereal rye dry mass per acre was already enough to reduce growth of those plants by more than 50%. Okay, so long story short, a very high amount of biomass, more than 7,000 pounds per acre, is necessary to significantly reduce emergence. However, you don't need a whole lot of biomass, more than approximately 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of biomass in there are already substantially reducing how fast those pigweed plants can grow. And then a following question that we get from our producers is, okay, so I know that I need biomass. What can I do in order to optimize biomass production by my cover crop? So here is some work that we've done over the past 3 years. Multiple sites, we're keeping track of cereal rye cover crop growth in the spring. Multiple times here we're planting in October, early November, just because of delayed harvest. Okay, so again, the limited window in the fall. And then we want to evaluate how does cover crops grow in the spring. In red here are the treatments that we terminated early, that we terminated with glyphosate 10 days to 14 days before crop planting. In green are the treatments that we terminated at crop planting for our standard conditions here in Wisconsin. And then in blue are the termination times, the late termination times, or the terminations that occurred after crop establishment. And as you can see here from our results, the more we delay this termination time, the more biomass our cereal rye cover crop can accumulate. So delaying that termination can be a good strategy to optimize and allow that cover crop to put more biomass. And here's just showing some of the pictures across some of the treatments from the studies that we've been conducting. Here's a tillage scenario. In the bottom panels here, we have a no pre-herbicide. On top, or the opposite, on the bottom here, we do have a pre-herbicide that was sprayed at planting. And then on top here, we have a no pre-herbicide scenario. And then the 6 soil management strategies: tillage, no-till, a cover crop that was terminated 14 days prior to planting, cover crop terminated at planting, and here's a scenario what we call this late planting, or cover crop that was terminated 10 days after crop planting there. And what's evident here in this image is that as you delay, the more biomass you accumulate, okay? But if you're terminating that cover crop too early, in season here, these pictures were taken late June, there is very little cover crop residue left. So this cover crops here, there's not enough biomass in there for weed suppression. Whereas in the scenario here where cover crop was delayed, was terminated at the time of planting, you see that nice mat of a cover crop residue in between your crop rows, doing that job of suppressing weeds and slowing down how fast they can grow. With that in mind, I want to switch gears and I want to talk about a study that's being funded by the United Soybean Board. This study is being conducted across the United States in 10 different states with 10 different universities and 11 different weed science collaborators. And the objective of this study is to evaluate the impact of planting green and cover crop by pre-emergence residual herbicide interactions on both pigweed dynamics and soybean yield. The major treatments that we're evaluating in the studies are the first one being soybean planting time. So we have an early planting time versus a late or standard planting time. The next treatment level is a yes versus a no pre-emerge herbicide. So we want to sort out how much weed suppression we can get from a effective pre-emerge herbicide versus from a high residue of a cover crop biomass. And then lastly here is this cereal rye termination management strategy. The first level is no cereal rye cover crop, so standard no-till, compared to cereal rye being terminated 10 days before planting versus cereal rye being terminated at planting. So this research was first established in the fall of 2020. We just wrapped up the first year of data collection, and these experiments are going to be replicated across all locations in the 2022 growing season. So stay tuned for those results when they become available. Here are just some pictures from our trial here in Wisconsin, taken earlier in the spring of 2021, and this year was just the amount of biomass we were able to obtain at this location was just amazing. It's the first time we were able to observe this amount of biomass in our research plots there, and we're going to get back to that a little bit later. From a weed control or a weed suppression point of view, this is phenomenal. It's a lot of cereal rye. However, from a crop establishment standpoint, we had some challenges that I'm going to get back to in a minute. So what are we learning from this trial? So these are some of the preliminary findings, just showing the Wisconsin data here for now. So on the left here, I'm going to focus first on the biomass production by our cereal rye cover crop. So on the left here, I have the early planted soybeans, and then on the right, I have the late planted soybeans. And within each planting time, we had two termination strategies, if you recall, terminating the rye 10 days prior to planting versus terminating that rye at planting. And just by letting that cover crop grow for 10 additional days, you can see here that we observe a substantial addition in regards to biomass. Okay, and then if we do both, if we delay our planting and we delay our termination, we plant green and we plant our soybeans a little later, this was the best case scenario regarding biomass, total biomass production by our cereal rye cover crop. And as I was saying here, that picture I just indicated, earlier this year, we were able to reach more than 10,000 pounds of cereal rye biomass in the study, which was quite amazing here for conditions in Wisconsin, where we have a very short growing season for cover crops before crop establishment. Now I want to switch gears and I want to talk about this figure on the right. So once the cover crops were terminated, the crops were planted, we monitored those plots on a weekly basis, and we were counting the number of Waterhemp plants, and we were also tracking their size. So when they reached 4 inches in height, when the pigweed plants reached 4 inches in height, we triggered our post-emergence herbicide application. So what we're learning here is that on top here is in the absence of a pre, the more biomass we observe from the cover crops the fewer plants we had in our plots. However, when we had a pre, the benefit, the pre's, regardless of the amount of cover crop biomass, they were quite effective in reducing water hemp density. What really got our attention here is when we combined a high biomass cover crop with an effective pre-emerge herbicide, we were able to delay our application by several weeks, or post-emergence application by several weeks. And one thing that I want to point out here is that this application is in this planting green scenario with the delayed soybean planting time with an effective pre-herbicide happened on July 14th. And the only reason why we triggered that post-emergence application is because our crop was about to reach the R2 growth stage, and that was the cutoff window for the post-emergence program we were gonna spray. There were very, very few water hemp plants in this plot. So again, this integrated strategy of high biomass cover crops combined with an effective pre-emerge herbicide delayed and reduced the amount of water hemp plants we needed to control post-emergence. And that's exactly what we want to see out there. We want to minimize the selection pressure on our post-emergence herbicide options in our soybeans because our effective options are very, very limited, and we got to take as much selection pressure from them as we can. One of the questions that I get once I recommend this strategies of high biomass of cover crops combined with a pre-herbicide is, Rodrigo, how will this high biomass systems impact deposition of my spray solution? So let's say I'm going to plant this soybeans here into this standing zero rye. How is that going to intercept my pre-emerge herbicide? So we're conducting some research that we started in 2020. We have 4 major treatments. We have a roller crimper, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And what we're doing here, we're pretty much rolling and crimping that zero rye right before planting. So we have this zero rye kind of horizontally or laid against the soil surface. They'll provide an easier scenario for crop planting and also for spraying. Okay, we compare this roller crimper scenario with a standing zero rye versus a tillage and a no-till scenario. What we did, we put some water sensitive paper right on top of the soil surface there where we want our pre's to be, and we evaluated how this different amounts of cover crop residue intercepted our spray solution. Long story short, here in blue, we have our tillage and no-till treatments where we did not have a cover crop. And then in green are the 2 treatments where we had the different amounts, or where we had the different strategies for a cover crop termination. Here is glyphosate only, and then here is that where we rolled and crimped. Again, this experiment was conducted in 2 years, and then the scenario for the 2 years are quite different because in 2020, we were able to produce a little over 4,000 pounds at the time we were planting the crops and spraying our pre's. However, as I indicated already, 2021 was a phenomenal spring for cover crop growth. So this year here, we were able to achieve more than 10,000 pounds. Okay, so what we're learning here is that the more biomass you have on that soil surface, the more interception of that pre-emergence herbicide application we're going to have. And that's what we're learning here. The main questions now is, okay, so if I'm going to be spraying a pre-herbicide on top of a heavy residue, how much rainfall do I need? And when do we need that rainfall to happen to wash that residual herbicide from the biomass of that cover crop into the soil surface? And remember that the soil is the target for pre-emerge and herbicides. I mentioned about roller crimper, so I want to expand on that a little more. Since we started, conducting research on planting green or planting cover crops into standing zero rye, where a high amount of biomass is produced, more and more producers are asking us about, roller crimper. How can I use a roller crimper? So we started a series of research, and I know several colleagues across the United States are doing similar work. What we've learned here in Wisconsin is that time is key. If you want the roller crimper operation to be effective for termination of the zero rye cover crop, you have to be patient. The zero rye cover crop has to be a full anthesis, because if you perform that crimping operation way before anthesis, you are not going to get a good termination of the zero rye cover crop. Yeah, even when we waited for full antithesis, we did our roller crimper. What we noticed is that some of this rye plants, they pop back up, so they were not completely controlled. Okay, so then when we observed that, when we paired that operation, the roller crimper operation, with the glyphosate for termination, this is when we observed the best results. So in that scenario where we were observing a lot of the cereal rye popping back up after you do your crimping operation, combining that crimping operation with glyphosate might be beneficial for effective termination. Otherwise, you may end up with a scenario like this in 2020, where we did the roller only. A lot of that rye popped back up, and that rye ended up competing with our soybeans, and there we observed some substantial yield reduction compared to the other treatments, which were termination of that cereal rye cover crop with glyphosate at the time of planting versus no cereal rye treatments here, a no-till and a tillage treatment. Okay, so appropriate termination of that cereal rye is also key to optimize soybean yield. And here are some images that Nick Arneson in our program took the following spring. So when we did that roller crimper, we didn't achieve effective termination of that cereal rye. Some of those rye plants were able to set seeds, and here you have that volunteer rye in the next year. Okay, and that's why, you know, this recommendation, if you're crimping, you may want to consider combining that crimping operation with a glyphosate application for effective termination of the cereal rye cover crop. Now I want to get a little bit into the challenges of this planting grain system or this high biomass cover crop scenarios. So here I'm going to pick two different locations where we conducted research in 2021, and I want to point out that this two research sites are about 25 miles apart, so they're not too far. However, we observed some contrasting results in regards to biomass production. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, if we want to optimize weed suppression from cereal rye, we need biomass production. Okay, and what we're learning here is that if you can plant a little earlier, so in this scenario here, the Brooklyn site, we achieved up to more than 10,000 pounds there of cereal rye biomass. Okay, and how we did that? We planted late September, and we used what we call a rustic variety. And that variety, this was the first time we used this variety in our research trials. It's commonly used by our colleagues here that do research in organic systems. And the colleagues and the farmers that have organic production, they like this variety because it's an early maturing variety and it produces a decent amount of biomass in the spring. So it was the first time we used it, and we had good luck in the sense of high biomass production. So by fine-tuning our variety and by planting earlier in the fall, we were able to achieve very high amounts of biomass in our research plots. Now, when we planted in the fall a little later, so in this case, we planted the cereal rye late October, and we used our standard variety that we've been using here for years in our research trials, this garden variety. The maximum amount we were able to produce in the spring there by the time we were planting our soybeans, and our late planted soybeans here are late May, was a little under 5,000 pounds. So two locations, not too far apart, but by planting earlier, by switching varieties, we were able to achieve a lot more biomass here at the Brooklyn site. Okay, so the management practices for your cover crops really matter. And if you're really after biomass for weed suppression, there are some things you can fine tune in your cropping systems in order to achieve that. Now, these are some of the challenges that we ran into at our Arlington Ag Research Station. We have a heavy-duty no-till John Deere planter that we have, at this research station. And with this planter here, we usually have no problem establishing our soybean crop into a heavy stand of cereal rye. Okay, but at this on-farm site in Brooklyn, Wisconsin, we have a Kinsey, and this Kinsey does a phenomenal job for no-till planting. But it really struggled this year with this high amount of cereal rye biomass. So we ended up having some issues there with final stand, which I'm going to describe later. So if you're going to go into the systems, high biomass system, if you're going to be planting green, you got to make sure you're well set up for some heavy residue, no-till scenario there with your crop planter. And here's just some pictures. of that scenario in Brooklyn where we had issues. So the no-till there, we had a perfect stand. Where we had that earlier termination with a little less biomass, we had no problems establishing our crops. However, in that planting green scenario with excessive biomass, we had some serious issues in our plots with crop stand. Okay, so planting, that plantability, being able to properly establish your crop when you have a high biomass scenario like this, it's very, very important. With that in mind, I reached out to my colleague, Dr. Brian Luck, here at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Biological Systems Engineering Department, and I asked for his advice. So the next slides that I'm going to present here are slides that were provided by Dr. Luck with some of his recommendations for growers looking into no-till, high-residue planter setup. First thing is row cleaners. Dr. Luck recommends that growers set to where they're skimming and moving residue, not doing the tillage. Settings may need to change with soil moisture changes and row unit downforce changes. Front no-till coulters are almost a must-have in Dr. Luck's opinion there. And he recommends that growers should, the no-till coulters should be set 1 inch shallower than the planting depth of your soybean seeds. Planting depth is going to be a function of gauge, wheel setting, row unit downforce, and then planter attachments such as the front coulters that we just talked about, and the planter speed. Test passes should be with the planter in the ground at operation speed. Heavier soils and increased residue require more pressure to keep the row unit in contact with the soil and achieve proper planting depth. Planters without central fill will lose weight as the seed box is empty, and that's important to keep in mind. In regards to furrow closing, more down pressure on the closing wheel is needed when you have this high amounts of cover crop residue to plant into. And aftermark wheels can relieve compaction caused by increased row unit downforce. That's some of the research that Dr. Luck and his lab have done over the past few years. Check settings as often as possible when planting into high residue cover crop systems. Changes in field conditions and residue thickness can change seeding depth. So it's important to ensure that the seeds are being placed correctly and that the seed firmers are keeping the seed firmly placed in the bottom of the furrow. So again, it's a little more complex system, and some fine-tuning in your systems might be necessary. One, to optimize cover crop biomass production and proper establishment of your crop. So this is what I had to share with you today. I hope the information provided herein was helpful. I'm gonna leave my contact information in the last slide. So please feel free to reach out if you have questions. Before I wrap things up, I just want to bring to your attention the cover crop resources that are available through the Take Action website. So we have some really amazing cover crop fact sheets that were put together by Esmond, Dr. Laux, and Dr. Bill Johnson and colleagues. These publications are available for download and they can be very helpful. We have different publications on cover crop species selection, cover crop establishment, herbicide persistence, and carryover to cover crops, which is a major concern by cover crop adapters, and then some recommendations for cover crop termination strategies, which is very relevant to what I just discussed here today. So make sure to go to the Take Action website and download those publications.